Welcome to our cybersecurity session. I'm Andrew Patterson, this is Paul Comerford. We are both Principal Technology Advisors in the Technology Policy Department, and we're going to talk to you about cybersecurity measures. It's mainly going to be focused on this issue of cost-benefit decisions and how you balance those, especially with regard to GDPR and personal data. So just to recap what the plan is, we've got this vote open. Hopefully that's self-explanatory. If anyone's just come in, if you want to vote for option 10, press 0. That's my fault for putting the wrong figures on the slides. So if you want to vote on that, please do now, but we'll leave that voting open for a few minutes whilst we give you an introduction. Then we'll close the voting, take a look at the results, and once we've looked at those results, Paul and I are going to talk to you just for a little while about some of these key cost-benefit decisions you might make and some of the considerations that maybe you've thought about, maybe you haven't. And then once you've heard us, hopefully that's some food for thought, and then hopefully when we get to the end, we'll vote again, and maybe the results will be different according to what you've heard. Maybe they won't, and maybe we'll get a slightly earlier break, but we'll see. So I will kick off by just saying that this is a session on cost-benefit. And what I'm going to first of all talk about is what GDPR says. I hope this is not news to anyone in this auditorium, but let's just make sure we're on the same page. Article 5.1f of GDPR is probably what you're looking at, although if you are in the law enforcement or intelligence services business, I don't know if anyone is, but you're going to be looking at certain parts of the 2018 Data Protection Act. Either way, whichever you look at, we're looking at this phrase of appropriate technical or organisational measures. Okay, and I hope that's not a surprise to anyone. And the good news about the law, as I'm sure you know, is that it allows flexible decision-making. So you've got this idea of the state of the art that you can take account of. Is what you want to do possible? Is it feasible? Is it effective? You can take account of the cost of a particular security measure, so that's good. And then you can balance all that against the issues of what's the nature of the processing, just how much of a privacy risk is it to your data subjects. And you can balance all that up and take an appropriate set of measures. And as I'm sure you're aware, or hopefully most of you will be aware, there's some more to be said about this in Article 32. But it doesn't give you a vast amount of specificity. It doesn't give you a vast amount of certainty or exactly what you should do. It does name check though, pseudonymization and encryption though. So those are things you might want to think about. So we need to take some of these security decisions because we want to take appropriate technical or organizational measures. And so the first thing to say is, well, there's no option, as I'm sure you're aware, of just doing everything just in case. Because, first of all, there's no such thing as a completely secure system, which I think is a fairly well understood point. But the other thing is whether you've got a really well-funded security department and a budget for that, or whether you're struggling for money and resources, one way or another, the money's going to run out at some point. So you have to do some sort of prioritization, yeah? And the best way to do that is based on risk. And so in privacy terms, that's going to be privacy risk that we're bothered about. So what we're looking for is the most benefit, security speaking anyway, for the least money, time or effort. And you'll also find as well, I put in that scenario as an example, the agency X uses an external payment services provider. So they've outsourced their payment card data processing. And that means they don't themselves have to comply with most of the PCI DSS regulations that I'm sure many of you may be aware of. So that's an exception to this rule that I would say is that most InfoSec standards, information security standards, they're not particularly prescriptive, and that's a good thing. It gives you flexibility to take the appropriate measures, okay? There are some exceptions like PCI DSS where you have to take a much more list-based, compliance-based approach. But in the general case, they don't apply to everything that you do, okay? So even PCI DSS only applies to the bits of your estate that process card data. So in the general case, you need to make some decisions, you need to take some risk-based prioritization, and actually, there aren't that many hard and fast rules. So this Danish guy behind me, Kierkegaard, he definitely wasn't talking about cybersecurity when he said that, because he wrote those words in 1844. So anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. We've actually got quite a lot of freedom of choice as to what we can do security-wise. And speaking from personal experience, and maybe you have some personal experience of this as well, it is quite anxiety-inducing sometimes, deciding exactly what to do. And if anyone thinks this process is easy, then, please come and see me afterwards and let me know what your secret is, because it is not actually as easy as you might think, doing this risk-based prioritization. So we've got lots of options, not so many hard and fast rules. Where do we start?
Thanks, Andrew. So in this section, I'm going to be talking about how to properly budget for installation, commission, and ongoing tuning of security tools. This is something a lot of organisations fail to consider properly, and often this leads to disastrous consequences. As many of you probably seen in the media, there are many instances of data breaches, and it's an all too common thing. There has been some research done on organisations' stock price following a data breach, and what it's found is that usually get a dip in stock price if there's a data breach that involves unauthorised access to confidential data, particularly ones that impact with availability. So we can see the graph on the slide here. Our aim really is to find the optimal level of security, but at the minimum cost, and this is not easy to achieve. So what we need to do is balance the risk that vulnerability poses against the cost of the security control to mitigate that. And that might seem quite simple on paper, but there is a lot of things we need to consider. So we need to look at the cybersecurity budget in detail, not only the products that we're going to purchase, the services that we're going to buy. We also need to look at the time taken to properly configure those and train the personnel. So let's look at the budget in more detail. It will depend on the organisation and the size of the organisation, obviously the budget that they have available, and it will depend whether they insource the security and they do it in-house, or they outsource it to an external organisation. And this will depend on the company policies. So the sort of questions that we need to answer are the type of services that are required, what suppliers you're going to use, whether you're going to use a particular vendor or a mixture of vendors. You might be tied into a particular supplier. Obviously, how much it will cost, and what sort of things you need to look for a particular supplier. Now, you can usually separate the costs into two broad categories. You've got hard costs. These are things like procuring the actual products, vendor support for those products, training and any personnel you require from the vendor, and also soft costs. And this is the time expenditure using your existing resources in the organisation to properly configure those devices. So looking at the initial hard costs first, these are the costs that are incurred to the organisation when they first purchase the products. So things like purchasing a firewall, an intrusion detection system, security event management system, threat intelligence platform, and so on. The licensing cost may vary depending on the vendor. So this might be per user, per CPU node. It will depend on the vendor that you're actually using. You might have database costs as well. If you're implementing a database servers. You might have vendor costs, things like consultancy fees and so on, and any third-party training that the vendor might supply. Then you've got your ongoing hard costs. These are the costs for support and personnel on an ongoing basis. So you're going to need personnel in place to operate the security and event management systems and so on. And the costs really obviously depend on the size of the organisation and the requirements. Then you've got the initial soft costs. These are the time-based costs. So if you're doing everything in-house, then you might need to spend more time on that than if you were outsourcing the security. And this thing takes time, so you have to think about things like configuring the various devices, tuning of them, which I'll talk about more later on, adapting the tool for what it needs to do. Then you've got ongoing operating soft costs, things like monitoring, incident response, maintenance, and so on. And also things like maintenance, so backups, updates, troubleshooting, and so on. And lastly, you've got the periodic or occasional soft costs, things like rule tuning and reports creation. Yeah. So I'm just going to hand over to Andrew now, who's going to have a look at the voting.
So, can we close the voting, please? And let's see if the demo gods are cooperating with us. Aha, right, here we go. So remember the scenario. We had a company T, we had, imagine you're the data protection officer. They've just acquired an agency X, and you want to know which security measures, which 3 out of these 10 security measures you would prioritize. So, let's take a look. Number 1, right, so the leader, by some measure, is, although not by a ton, is a network penetration test of the internal estate of agency X. So bear in mind that these are all good things to do, okay? We're just interesting to see which ones you'd rather do first. So the top one is a penetration test, okay? I'll talk about that later. The next 4, all on sort of 13%-ish, but somehow showing slightly different heights of graph. I don't know how that works. But you can get the general appearance. So that looks like HTTPS configuration on Agency X's website, an intrusion detection system for Agency X's estate. Number 6 is an internal vulnerability scan. I will also talk about that later. And number 10, which of course was option 0 on your remote control, was an external web application test of Agency X's website. So I think there's 5 clear winners there, and there's 5 marginal losers, I think. So we weren't too happy about the manual IT asset audit, less happy about configuration management database or some other sort of asset management type tool, and similarly happy with or unhappy with 2-factor authentication for all your employees. Even less popular was an automated assets discovery scan, and even less popular than that was installing a threat intelligence platform. So that's kind of interesting there. Have we got the, you think you can remember the pattern of that, Paul? We've got penetration test, seems to be the favourite, and then we've got 4 sort of runners-up, which is HTTPS, intrusion detection, internal vulnerability scan, and a web application test. So that's really, really interesting to see. We're about to talk to you about 5 areas of security that illustrate this cost-benefit decision that you have to make all the time. I think that illustrates it very well. Maybe your opinion will change, and I can perhaps see how your opinion might change, hopefully, by the time we're done. I will let Paul crack on with the first 2 of those 5 things. I'll do number 3 and 4, and then Paul will finish off with number 5, and then we'll take that vote again.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Okay, so first thing I'm going to talk about is cost benefit of asset management. Organizations only have a general idea of the assets they want protecting. In a lot of cases, they don't have a full picture. And you need to consider everything. So not just the hardware, the security hardware you have, also the software, the data that you're storing, and so on. And there needs to be sufficient time given to develop effective security policies and processes for asset management. So these are the physical and technical controls to protect those assets. So we're going to look at some best practices now to do that. Okay, so on the diagram there, you can see a network diagram of a typical organization. Now, the point of this is you need to know what you have connected to you to protect those systems, okay? It's all very well having the latest technology boxes, spending thousands of pounds on fancy firewalls, intrusion detection systems, and so on. If you have, for example, a web server that's vulnerable connected to your network, that can undo all your hard work. It's really important to know exactly what you have connected and where it's connected to. So the key point is you need to take the time to do proper network discovery using any of the discovery tools out there. You see one on the slide there. That is a commercially available tool. There are many available, commercial and open source, that will do the job. You need to make sure you have a complete picture of the network all times, and also this is regularly updated. So if you have, say, a company takeover or an reorganization in the company and the network infrastructure changes, then this needs to be reflected in the network diagram. Now, there is quite a high profile case of this where things went badly wrong. I'm sure you all remember the TalkTalk breach of a few years ago, in 2015. It was heavily publicized on the media. Just to recap what happened in this breach, TalkTalk took over another company, and they took over their assets, and their network was connected into TalkTalk's network. And attackers managed to find a vulnerable web server that was running in the organization that was taken over. And this had a database running that had some personal data on it. They used the SQL injection attack to perform the, to get into the system. And what was found was that there was no appropriate restrictions in place. So, you know, the attackers were basically free to access the information and extract it. And TalkTalk didn't actually have any proactive monitoring facilities in place to discover that that web server was vulnerable, and you know, there was that possibility of attack. The result was that 150,000 customers' personal data was compromised, and TalkTalk were heavily fined by the ICO as a result. At the time, that was a £400,000 fine. And that was the time that was the largest fine that we had actually given out. After that, there was a report, an investigation into what happened, and they found that actually the financial and staffing resources were actually fine. They were in place, but they did not have any robust measures to check the status of the systems. So the key point from this is really, if you don't have any awareness of what's connected to your network, then you can't check for any old vulnerabilities, doing vulnerability testing or pen testing. And if they are publicly accessible on the internet, sooner or later, the attackers are going to find those and exploit them. And that's exactly what happened with TalkTalk. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to talk about is configuration management, which is another important factor to consider. Device management is obviously a really important part of the security process. You need to be in control of the devices that your users are using and have access to access your network. If you don't, then you're going to open yourself up to security risks and possible personal data leaks. So you need an up-to-date asset inventory, and it needs to be reviewed on a regular basis. This should include things like location of the asset, description of it, its owner, what classification it might be, and any configuration details. The other thing you need to consider is not only the on-site assets, but also cloud-based assets and any virtual assets as well, not just physical. And the owner of those assets needs to be responsible for inventory, the security of them, and also the disposal. So these assets will have end of life, and they need to be disposed of securely. You also need to track devices that are owned by the organization, of course, but also if you operate a bring your own device policy, then they need to be considered too. So if you don't have a good configuration management system in place, then it can cause all sorts of problems. For example, an organization will lose control over the status or its location of its assets. It might not be able to track those. And that goes back to the TalkTalk example I was talking about earlier. You might have some bugs that have been fixed and suddenly they reappear for no reason because the configuration management is not in place. or a wrong version of a system or a component might appear in production. So we need to make sure we've got appropriate measures in place to manage the devices. Now, you might think a bring your own device policy is a good thing, and certainly it's a money-saving measure, but the cost of enforcing security controls on those devices might actually exceed the savings of implementing that. So it's not always in the best interest to do that. So I'm going to talk a bit now about cybersecurity monitoring. Security budget, often it's the case that people will just go out and buy the most expensive kit they can find because they think that will do the job. They think the answer to everything is just buying the fanciest firewall or intrusion detection system. They can plug it in and it will solve all their problems. So they just buy high-end hardware and software. But this isn't the complete picture. Of course, they are useful, but you also need to support processes, things like intrusion monitoring, asset management, which I talked about earlier, and so on. Often vendors can be quite confusing and vague in what they're actually offering. So you might end up buying some unsuitable goods, sometimes obviously expensive as well. And also, you might purchase some proprietary tools that may not integrate very well with your current setup. One of the other big issues is the lack of security expertise. There is a big shortage out there of trained security analysts to actually use the hardware and software that you've procured. So you need to make sure that you've got the right training in place for those people, and they are sufficiently qualified to operate that particular hardware and software. So you need to recruit, properly train these analysts to ensure everything is configured optimally. The other thing you need to know is cybersecurity intelligence. So you've got the hardware and the software, you've got the personnel, but you need to make sure that hardware and software is fed with good quality security intelligence so you can make informed decisions to decide whether it's a breach or not, as the case may be. Okay, so you might think, why is there a guy tuning a guitar there? Well, what we're going to talk about now is tuning. Not guitar tuning, but tuning of security devices. So some people will configure a intrusion detection system or a security event management system and think it'll just work. They think they can plug it in and it will do its job. But these things need tuning. They don't work so well out the box unless they're specifically tuned to that environment that they're working in. And this needs to be done regularly. If we don't, then we get a lot of false alarms, and that's something we want to minimize. We need to reduce that to an acceptable level, so we're only listening to the events that, could be an attack. So, there is the risk of actually missing a breach if this is not properly done. The other advantage of tuning is it makes things smoother. So the security team can focus on the job they need to do and not waste too much time on events that maybe just be normal business and not actually an alert at all. So you need a dedicated team in place to manage this, things like intrusion detection rules and use cases and so on. So you need to feed the right information into the system. So some best practices. You need to tune the system to identify expected events. This reduces the time to investigate a legitimate event, so you're not spending too much time wasted on that. You need to detect unexpected events, so that helps reduce false negatives, and manage misleading data. So that's basically noise, which is anything that's not relevant, as opposed to signal, which could be a legitimate event. Another useful thing to do is create a use case library of incidents. So if an alert triggers, then the security team will be able to respond to that, and they will have a response that's consistent and repeatable. And that's usually called an alert playbook when that is done. Okay, so I'm done on that section. I'm going to pass back to Andrew now, who's going to talk about security testing.
Brilliant. So we've got 2 out of our 5 areas talked about that. Asset management, and the kind of benefit you can get from that, and tuning and maintenance, budgeting for that as part of your procurement process, not just buying the latest shiny box. So the third out of the five things I want to talk about is this issue of security testing. And I want to just explore this issue of whether you go for a broad security test or a deep security test. And I apologise if you've seen me speak before. I go on about this all the time because I used to work for a testing company, and it's something I've seen a lot of, and I think it illustrates this idea of cost-benefit analysis really, really well. So I'm going to talk specifically about comparing vulnerability scanning with penetration testing. Now, if you don't know what these terms mean, that's fine because I'm just about to explain them. The company I used to work for, their bread and butter work was doing vulnerability scanning. So generally speaking, vulnerability scanning involves automated tools, and they perform a wide range of quite shallow tests across your network. Compared to that, penetration testing involves really significant human manual effort. It involves a skilled human working, trying to apply their human ingenuity to try and simulate what a real-life attacker would do. Okay, to try and prove that your security measures are adequate. And if they're not, you'll know how and why. So typically speaking, when you're buying a vulnerability scanning service, you'll be buying a tool or a license to operate a tool. And then in comparison with penetration testing, you're typically buying a person or persons manual effort. So you're typically paying per person per day. So because of the time and skill involved, you'll generally find that for the same scope of systems, vulnerability scanning is really significantly cheaper than penetration testing, which is a great deal more expensive. Sometimes, I mean, depending on exactly what you compare, it's probably an order of magnitude cheaper. It might be 10 times cheaper, it might be 100 or maybe even 1,000 times cheaper, depending on exactly what you're going to test and what you're comparing. So don't take that as any sort of blanket endorsement of it, but it is generally cheaper. And that lower cost means that if you have a limited amount of money, well, you're going to be able to cover a greater scope if you use the automated tool, so if you use vulnerability scanning. On the flip side of that, if you commission a penetration test, or a pen test in the jargon, you'll actually end up with very, very detailed, very relevant and focused results. So essentially, that's a really good balancing act. Do you want to pay more for more focus, more relevance, more detail, or do you want to pay less and get a broader picture? And if you compare the time and the cost considerations of both scanning and pen testing, you'll see that it's really feasible to scan your systems monthly, say. That's really normal. That's what, for instance, PCI DSS says. Oh, sorry, forgive me. That's really common to do. PCI DSS actually says you have to do it quarterly, but that's another issue. But it's really feasible to do it monthly. Lots of people are doing it weekly. Some people are even moving towards continuous scanning, which is to say you scan all your stuff, and then as soon as that scan's finished, you start the next one. So it is feasible, depending on the setup. Whereas, because of the time and the cost involved, if you're getting pen testing done, you're typically going to be wanting to do that after a major change or maybe annually. So that's the kind of thing that most organizations will be looking at, typically, annually or after a major change. And then another consideration is if you're going to do the automated thing, if you're going to do vulnerability scanning, then that does actually involve a significant amount of false positives sometimes. And having managed an estate that was quite large, sometimes the work involved in administrating the false positives and weeding out what's a false positive and what isn't can be quite significant. Whereas if you've paid a skilled human to do a penetration test, you're going to get a very low false positive rate because they will have manually verified what they're doing. So why am I talking about this? It's to illustrate this issue of broad versus deep. You sort of pay your money, take your choice. Do you want to draw a broad picture or a deep picture? And a slightly vague analogy is this. So if you look on the left-hand side there, that's a beautiful picture of the Austrian Alps. Ignore the guy in the front, that's me. Beautiful Alps, lovely view. But if you look at the picture on the right, you'll see that's the same picture, incredibly blurry on purpose, but I've zoomed out a bit. And obviously the one on the left is a bit more pretty to look at because you can see the scenery. The one on the right, however, is much more useful because you can see right behind me is a massive cliff edge, which is, I don't want to be falling off. but it's okay. You can see the blurry outline of some safety netting. So I know a bit more about my environment, and I can actually do something with that picture compared to the first one, which is pretty and detailed, but actually quite limited in scope. So slightly simple analogy there, but it's just to make this point that it's much better to have a blurry picture of everything than a detailed picture that doesn't cover everything. That's what I'm saying. Because otherwise, you're going to end up with whatever you call it. It's going to be unknown unknowns, unmanaged risks. People have different words for it, but basically stuff you don't know about. And if you don't know about it, you can't secure it. You don't even know what position you're in. So that's what I would say about that balance. And another thing to say is that if you're going to do testing, whether it's vulnerability scanning or penetration testing, make sure you can actually do something with the results. It's sadly common, I've seen it in the testing work I've done and some of the casework I've looked at with the ICO, is that the number of penetration tests or vulnerability scans whose results are ignored, in effect, by organizations. This is not a good thing. And sometimes it's more directly, sometimes it's indirect. Sometimes the organization really does want to fix it, but doesn't have the resource available to actually carry out the remediation work. In which case, how much value for money are you really getting? You know, you've paid your money, but what benefit do you really get from it, from the test? And that leads on to my next point, which is, if you've done some testing and you've got some results and you're meaning to fix them, well, what is the point in paying, say, for another penetration test before you've made some serious effort to fix the previous results? So my conclusion for this little section, before I move on to the next one, is that my suggestion would be get that blurry but complete picture first. So you're looking at doing something automated like a vulnerability scan in preference first, fix whatever you find there, and then you can go and look at maybe commissioning a penetration test, because then you'll have that blurry picture of everything, so you know perhaps where you ought to focus your effort, spend your money more in a more focused fashion, and you'll get better value for money overall, because if you do your penetration test, these highly skilled humans, which you are paying a significant amount of money for, won't be finding easy stuff that you could have found with a vulnerability scan. So you get value for money all the way around. So that's my point there. Broad testing versus deep testing. The next cost-benefit thing I think I'd like to talk about is to do with authentication techniques. And I think the best way to just talk about this is with two examples, 2 slides, example on each one. So I'm talking here about things like password logins, okay? So to give you a quick example, let's imagine you've got an internal network login at a company. Let's say this company is about 100 employees big. It doesn't really matter too much, but just so you can visualize it. And let's imagine that most of those users have standard access. Let's imagine that that access is quite limited, so you know who needs to access what. You've got role-based access control. You've got authentication in place to access resources within the network. And you're also monitoring it quite well and auditing it so that you can know who's accessed what and when. So if anything bad does happen, you have some chance of being able to clear up the mess. So that's all good. But you do have a small number of people who need administrative access, as most companies do. You have some system administrators. But everyone needs to be able to access your corporate network from the outside, because you want people to be able to work on the move, which is perfectly reasonable. So they're going to connect in using a virtual private network, a VPN. So what do you require people to do when they log into this VPN? Well, look at the risk involved in these cases. Look at your standard user. If you've already got good controls in place, and let's assume we have, in this case, you've got that good role-based access control, you've got that monitoring and auditing, think about what damage could one person's account compromise really do? Maybe not a lot. So perhaps you'd take that decision to only make your standard users use a password. But compare that with the administrative user who, with their privileges, with their account, let's say, it doesn't have to be malicious as well. They don't have to go rogue or be a disgruntled employee or something like that. Maybe they themselves are compromised by someone. But the point is, just if their account is compromised, they can do much more damage. That can do much more damage. So maybe you want to spend a little bit more money, get some hardware tokens perhaps, something extra, some multi-factor authentication for your administrators. That kind of cost-benefit balance you can make depending on the risk presented. And before I move away from this example, just note in passing that if you're going to use biometric authentication in this employment context, then think very carefully before you just do that and make it mandatory. You may find it difficult to find a lawful basis because you'll need to, it'll be difficult to get truly free consent. Not saying you can't do it, but think about that very carefully. And if it's not sort of explicitly expressed in the contract that you're giving people, that might be quite difficult as well. So I'm not saying don't use it, I'm just saying have a think if you can use biometric authentication, because that is, of course, special category data under GDPR. And my second example for this would be a bit more of a simple one. This is more like almost like a social media app. So imagine you've got a publicly available login to a web app. And just because I had beer on the mind when I wrote this example, let's imagine it's for reviewing beers and breweries. Okay? The whole point of this site is it's publicly available. You log in, you create your own account, and then you start typing your reviews of beers and reading other people's reviews and commenting on their reviews, things like that. So it's supposed to be open, freely available, anyone can sign up. So look at the amount of personal data that people are really going to get access to. What sort of problems would it create if one person's account was compromised? Maybe not a lot. So perhaps give your standard user who signed up password-only access, I think. But think about the multi-factor authentication. Maybe you don't make it mandatory, but maybe you make it possible for people who do want to use it. So there are quite a few online services that give you the option to have two-factor authentication if you want. And I think that's reasonable, personally speaking, because you make that balance, because if you only require people to use a password, well, it's well understood, as long as you apply sensible rules, such as minimum lengths, minimum strengths, as long as you apply sensible measures, you'll be okay. And just the last point here is to do with credential stuffing. I don't know if anyone knows what that is. Any show of hands, maybe? Anyone know what credential stuffing is? Yeah, I've got a smattering of people who know what that is. Basically, it's people taking previously breached credentials and just trying in an indiscriminate fashion to try and log into various online services using those previously breached usernames and passwords. So that is a risk here because it's a completely public login. The whole point is it's publicly available, people can log in. So make sure you've got those mitigations in, like limiting the rate of login attempts. And related to this as well, I must make another point, which is the point about previously breached passwords. So the credentials that people are using to make these credential stuffing attacks, they've already been breached, and there are services like haveibeenpwned.com that you can go and check whether your password has already been used or not, has already turned up in a breach. So if you're in charge of one of these login screens, then why wouldn't you check if the password someone wants to use up when they sign up for the account? Why wouldn't you check and see if that has been breached already? And if it has, tell them no, I'm not going to let you use that password because it is proven to be insecure. So that's becoming a lot easier to do now. Certain products are integrating that kind of functionality into how they work. So I've talked a little bit about authentication techniques. I must hand over to Paul, and then we will open the voting for a final time.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. So in the last section, I'm going to talk a little bit about web security. Obviously, most organizations will have some sort of web services. There's not many of these days that don't. So it's essential to make sure your websites are secure because often personal data is going to be transferred over them. One of the biggest security problems, though, is that encryption is optional. It's not a mandatory requirement. So it's something we have to add on as an extra. Now, of course, website security is enforced with HTTPS. This secures the data, and this is done over TLS, Transport Layer Security. It provides three things. The first is encryption. So any data transferred is encrypted securely, and eavesdroppers cannot access that information. It also provides integrity, so the data can't be modified in transit, and an attacker can't make any modification to it. And also authentication. So this basically proves that the website is legitimate and is not a false website or so on. Really, it's very difficult not to justify not using HTTPS now. There was a misconception that it's difficult to implement or it's too slow, and that is really not the case. Most major browsers now will actually mark HTTP sites as insecure. So you can see on the slide there at the top, that's Google Chrome, and it actually marks the HTTP site as not secure, and at the bottom we have the secure version marked in green there. Now, as for the speed aspect, TLS is actually quite fast, and in fact, if it's used with HTTP version 2, it can outperform plain text communication, so it's no slouch. Some important tips. Use the latest version of TLS, which currently stands at 1.2. I think 1.3 is currently in development, but 1.2 at the moment is the current standard. Prior to TLS being introduced, we used SSL. Now, all versions of SSL are insecure, so this should not be used under any circumstances. If you are under jurisdiction of PCI DSS, then the regulations there say you need at least TLS 1.1. But there's no real reason why you shouldn't be using the latest version anyway with that. Another useful feature in relation to this is HSTS, and that stands for HTTP Strict Transport Security. And this basically automates the process. So if you type in a HTTP instead of HTTPS by mistake, it will automatically redirect you to the secure version of the site. In addition to that, it will also force Google to only show secure websites and no unsecure versions. So all major web servers support this now, so you just need to enable it in your server configuration. There's also another function called HSTS preloading, which automatically redirects the HTTP traffic to HTTPS, and this just speeds up the process. Okay, in the few minutes I've got left now, I'm just going to talk a little bit about digital certificates. Now, if you want to implement HTTPS for your website, obviously you're going to need a digital certificate to do this. And again, there's this misconception that it's annoying, it's expensive, it's time-consuming, but it really isn't. These are, of course, issued by a certificate authority. So some tips: choose one that's widely trusted by both your customers and in general security circles. Make sure it can be easily revoked. So if the certificate is compromised, then you can easily revoke that certificate. And also one that can be renewed automatically as well. Now, good certificates, you'll be able to do this no problem at all. Also, you need to make sure your certificate is valid for every DNS name you point it to. For example, if your organization uses various DNS names. And the last thing is, not all certificates are created equal. So you need to make sure that appropriate cryptography is in place for the task. Now, I'm not going to get into cryptographic algorithms. It's not the place, and we haven't got the time. But you should be using the latest recommended standards. Now, the likes of NCSC has good guidance on this. The ICO themselves have some encryption guidance as well, and that goes through all the best practices for that. So lastly, I'm going to have a look at the SSL Server Labs tool. Has anyone actually used this in the audience? Yeah, a few people. Yeah. So this is a very useful tool, and it basically tests the security configuration of your website. So things like encryption algorithms used, TLS, of course, that I've talked about. You can see on the slide here, this particular organization is using an older version of TLS, and various other cryptographic protocols are out of date. So it's scored a security grade C, which is pretty poor. So it wouldn't take much to upgrade that web server, change the cryptographic protocols, to make sure it was meeting the requirements. Now this is a free tool, it's free to use on the internet. I put the link there on the left hand side. So best practice, try it on your website, not just initially but periodically as things change. Check your configuration is meeting the requirements. Okay, so I'm going to hand back over to Andrew now, who's going to discuss the voting. Okay.
Right, really, really quickly. So 5 things we talked to you about: asset management, tuning maintenance of your tools in addition to the capital cost, vulnerability scanning versus penetration testing, broad versus deep, authentication measures, passwords only or more things, and HTTPS configuration. So with that in mind, can we open the voting again? All right, brilliant. The voting is open again. So please do, if you want to take your voting handsets. Has your opinion changed about these 10 security measures behind me? Press 3 digits, one after the other, and choose your top 3 out of those 10. And then I will very, very, very quickly summarize the results. So whilst you're voting, let me just explain. I'm sorry we don't have time for a question and answer. However, Paul and I will be just outside the exit of the auditorium in there for at least the next half hour. If you've got any burning questions, absolutely love to talk to you about anything you've got to ask us. But, okay, are we still voting? Has anyone not voted? Anyone not voted? Okay, so 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Can we close the voting, please? Cool. Right, let's move on and see if our opinions have changed. Haha! I knew it. Number 6. So internal vulnerability scans. Yeah, I did a really good sales job there, didn't I? So we've seen quite a big change. So internal network penetration testing was the leader. Has now fallen quite a bit. Number 1. My sales pitch for vulnerability scanning has brought number 6 up a bit. Number 3 and number 5, so HTTPS configuration and configuration management database, that's stayed kind of where it is, if I remember rightly. Yeah. We've had even fewer votes for a threat intelligence platform at number 9, and I can guess the reasons for that. I think that's probably not the first thing you'd think about if you were coming in blind to a situation like that scenario before. So yeah, I'm glad to see that people's opinions have changed. What else have we seen? HTTPS configuration, where's that? Number 3, yeah, that stayed about where it ought to have been. Yeah, okay, where it ought to have been, about where it was. Okay, so that's really, really interesting. I'm glad something changed and we weren't just changing. Did anyone not change their answers at all? Okay, we only got a couple. Okay, so it just shows you how much you can be persuaded, influenced, how much freedom you have. Hopefully there's a little bit less anxiety involved after this session. Thank you. Thank you.